Welcome students to this video lecture on the human tissues. We're building off of our lecture of the cellular structure and function, and as we were kind of talking about the individual cells, now we're going to talk about a group of cells working together for a common function, and that they kind of have the same structure then too, and that's going to be related to as a tissue. So let's take a peek at our objectives here. When we go through this chapter, we're going to be taking a look at a few things only. Compare and contrast the characteristics of the four human tissues, and then compare and contrast the epithelial membrane. So there's a lot more to it than that, but we'll be covering those two broad objectives here. So again, tissues are a group of cells similar in structure and function. So they have the same sort of shape to them, right? And then ultimately they have the same function, right? You don't have liver cells up in the epidermis of your skin, the outer layer of your skin. Those cells do not have the same structure, and those cells do not have the same function. So you're not going to see those grouped together. But the types of tissues that we have are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue or muscular tissue, and nerve or neural tissue. So we'll go through each one of these. But before we get into that, when we discuss tissues, or when we look at tissues, there's two aspects that we want to examine in close detail. One being the cells themselves, the shape, the size, the nucleus orientation or location, and so forth, their function. And then two, the extracellular matrix, otherwise also referred to as, I'll say a lot, as the matrix, the space around the cells. And what is that space filled up with, if there is space? Is there any space is another good question too. So here we have our types of tissues. We have the nerve tissue, brain and spinal cord are the common. Muscular tissue, we'll talk about skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Epithelial tissue, we'll talk about epithelial tissue, but forms boundaries between environments, protects, secretes. Connective tissue does all sorts of different things, supports, protects, binds other tissues together. So let's take a look at starting with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, there's two main types of epithelial tissue, and this is divided into location. So there's covering and lining epithelia. That's on the external and internal surfaces. So if you think of your skin and you think of like the internal digestive system, that's the lining epithelia. Then we have the glandular epithelia, which is cells that secrete out various different substances within glands. So it's more glandular, it's a secretion sort of thing. One's then covering, okay? So it's pretty self-explanatory there. So the characteristics of epithelial tissue is that the cells have polarity, and I don't want you to think of it as like a negative and positive charge, but there's an apical region, and then there's a basal region or surface, and you want to think of the apical region being what's open to the environment that is exposed to. So the basal is the lower portion of that region of the cell or cells that is attached to the surface, and then the apical region is what's exposed to the environment or what's exposed to the lumen. So think of the digestive system, the stomach, the inner lining of the stomach is the mucosa, and the cells that form the mucosa that actually are exposed to the food that's coming into the stomach, that's the apical region, and then the basilar region of those cells are attached to the lower surface of the epithelial tissue. Are composed of closely packed cells. Now this is good because whether we're talking about single or multiple layers of epithelial cells, what we find common is that there is very little to no matrix. They're one cell kind of packed on top of another cell or right next to each cell and held together by tight junctions and desmosomes. Supported by a connective tissue reticular lamina underneath the basal lamina, and that's going to be referred to as the basement membrane. It's referred to, so the bottom layer is always going to be connected to this basement membrane, and we'll talk about that here in a second. It's avascular. That means there's no blood vessels that run through the epithelial tissue, but it is innervated, so it does have nerve control going to it, but there's no blood vessels, and we'll see that more when we talk about the skin and that sort of thing when we get into that lecture. And a high rate of regeneration. That means these cells, the turnover rate is fairly high, where they're continuously being made, and new cells are being made as the old ones are being pretty much scraped off, and so you need a continuous sort of process of cells being kind of reborn or reproduced as the living tissue is being exposed to the environments. So one thing that we talk about with epithelial tissue is we talk about the number of layers, excuse me, the number of layers that we find in epithelial tissue, and then the cell size. So first thing that you want to ask is how many layers are there? Is there one layer, that's simple epithelium, or is there multiple layers, that's stratified epithelium? So here's one layer here of cells, and that's then referred to as simple. It's one layer. So let me go through some of these sort of high points here. So this line right here separating the cells, the bottommost layer will have this basement membrane. So this red line is the basement membrane being connected to the basal surface of the cell. Here's the apical surface, the outermost surface here. Okay. Now this is stratified, so we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of cells here. Okay. It still has the basement membrane attached here at the bottom. You don't see any blood vessels running through here because it's avascular. But when we have 2 or more layers, it's called stratified. And the bottommost layer is still going to be connected to the basement membrane. And then this is the basal surface, okay? And this is the apical surface, okay? So we have still that, those terms being referred to as stratified. The second thing you ask then is what type of cell it is, as in what size or what shape does it take? Is it squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, okay? So then it's going to be either simple squamous or stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, okay, and so forth. So there's going to be one or multiple layers, and then the size of the cell. So squamous is referring to as like a flattened cell. So you can see here there's more of like a flattened cell. Cuboidal is more cube-like shape, and columnar is more column shaped like that. So pretty straightforward stuff. And so again, when we talk about the epithelial and the different regions that we find it in, we want to be, we're going to talk about the description of it. Is it simple or stratified, and then squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, the function, and then the location and stuff like that. So let's take a peek here. So here is simple squamous epithelial tissue. Simple squamous. Simple is referring to one layer. Squamous is referring to the flattened shape, and epithelial is referring to epithelial tissue, okay? So here's the basement membrane. We can see this bottom thing here, that's the basement membrane. So we can see there's this one small layer of cells. Now when you see just simple squamous, okay, when it's just one layer of these flattened thin cells, this is going to allow for diffusion, that process of diffusion that we talked about, okay? So it's much easier for molecules to pass through this thin layer of cells, just this one thin layer of cells, molecules in various different products that need to get through. So in the lungs here, you can kind of see here is, these different regions here. These are all simple squamous epithelial tissue, okay? And so air comes down into the lungs, and it's got to pass into the blood vessels, so it wants to pass through the lung tissue that's very, very thin, okay? So if it was stratified, there was multiple layers of cells here, the oxygen and the various different gases wouldn't be able to diffuse in and out of the lungs, okay? The lung cavity, the lung space. So simple squamous, when you see simple squamous epithelial tissue, it is for allowing substances to move in and out of a region or kind of pass through, okay? Diffusion is the good word, or probably the best word to use for that. So it's utilized for diffusion, and it's found in the lungs primarily, and it's the blood vessels are simple squamous too. So all your blood vessels are made up of a one layer thick simple squamous epithelial tissue to form those blood vessels, or I should say the capillaries are. Okay, so the capillaries have that, the smallest type of blood vessel. So two other locations, and I'm not gonna get into this, but the lining of lymphatic vessels, blood vessels, and heart. Okay, so simple squamous really largely found in blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, a little in the heart, but more than in the lungs then too. Okay, don't worry about these terms here. Now, simple cuboidal, again, it's just one simple meaning one layer. Cuboidal referring to cube-like shape, so we have cube-like shape here. Their goal is secretion absorption. So they do a lot of different sort of activities. It's not for diffusion. They're a little too thick for materials to pass, compounds, molecules to pass through them. Kidney, you find them in the kidney tubules a lot, and so you can see here's these little tubules. They're kind of flattened right now, but you can see the tube would be right through here, that lumen, and these are simple cuboidal cells there. Okay, so again, usually used for secretion and absorption. Simple columnar epithelial tissue. Now these are a single layer of column-like cells here, okay? And they usually have some sort of microvilli or cilia, those little hair-like extensions coming off of them. And these guys are really geared for absorption and secretion, but more goal is absorption. So think of the digestive tract, right? And in the small and large intestine, what we have a lot of is these simple columnar epithelial cells. So they're column-like, and they usually, you can kind of see they have these little microvilli, in this case, coming off of them, increasing the surface area of the cells to increase the surface for absorption area in the digestive tract, okay? We see them in all sorts of different areas. This one's the stomach. We'll see it, simple columnar, in the trachea even, and stuff like that. So they're all over the place. The main goal is absorption, and they'll secrete out mucus and stuff like that, but absorption typically is its main goal, especially in the digestive system. And again, they're just one layer of these columnar shaped cells, and it still has the basement membrane. As you can see here, here's the basement membrane. So here's the basal region, and here's the apical region of the cells here, okay? Now we can have pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So pseudo is kind of like given the appearance, fake looking, and stratified means multiple layers. So if you look here, this kind of looks like it's multiple layers of columnar cells, when in fact all of these cells, even if it's a very small region of the cell, touches the basement membrane. So you can see this cell touches the basement membrane, touching the basement membrane. This cell is actually going to come down and touch the basement membrane. So it looks stratified, as in it looks like there's two layers, but it's technically one, and it's just referred to as pseudostratified. Okay, and you can see the cilia. That's kind of cool. The cilia coming off here of these cells, and this is going to be found in the trachea, where we have then a lot of mucus being secreted and the cilia pushing that mucus along there. So you can kind of see it looks like there's multiple layers here, but in fact, all of these cells, even if it's a small portion of the cell, will touch that basement membrane, making it only simple technically. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So you can see here, this is multiple layers of those thin cells. And the stratified squamous is really what we think of when we think of skin and other sort of areas of our body that are, prone or subjected to abrasion. Okay, so areas of the body that get abrased or kind of have a lot of friction on. Think of your outer skin. Think of the throat, your esophagus as you swallow food. That's consistently getting scraped. Your mouth. Okay. And so what this is you can see there's multiple layers of cells here. New cells are made down here at the basal region and push up the older cells. At some point, these older cells will die and release sometimes keratin if it's in the skin. But as these older cells get pushed up towards the surface, they'll be flaked off or brushed off, and that's called dander if it's on the skin. Dandruff if it's on your scalp. That's just dead skin cells coming off of your skin. So we can see that this serves as a protection, right? It's not going to allow for absorption, or it's not going to allow for diffusion, because there's a lot of cells that oxygen or whatever molecule needs to get through to get to the other side here. It's not just like one thin layer of cells. So this is more of a protective barrier that we see stratified. So we can see stratified here within the lining of the esophagus. And so here's the basement membrane down here. The bottom cells are attached there. They grow and divide, produce new cells. Those cells get pushed up to the surface as other ones are made, and eventually those will get flaked off there. So that's stratified squamous epithelial tissue. It's used largely for protection and protects underlying tissues in areas that are subjected to abrasion. Stratified cuboidal, you don't really see it all that much. It's 2 layers of cube-like shaped cells. Not really going to even get into that. Stratified columnar, again, very, very rare in the body. We're not going to even look at that because it's something that you don't come across. I think simple squamous and stratified squamous, to understand the difference of why certain areas would be stratified, multiple layers, and why certain areas would be simple squamous is very important to understand. So make sure you recognize and understand the difference of the role of stratified versus simple in the squamous shaped cells, okay? And we talked about that there. Transitional epithelial tissue, this is something that we see in certain areas of the body, and you can kind of see they kind of transition from one sort of shape to another. So it resembles both like stratified squamous and stratified cuboidal. And what this does is it stretches readily and permits distension of the urinary organ. So the bladder will have some of this in there because it allows for kind of distension. The bladder fills up with urine. It's got to kind of have like a little stretchy sort ofness to it. And so then we see that transitional epithelial. Okay, and that's really the only place that we're going to see that. Connective tissue, our second type of tissue. This is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue. One thing I want to say, it doesn't matter if we're talking about simple or stratified squamous epithelia. Look at the matrix space here. There is no space around these cells. These cells are piled on top of one another, one cell after another. There is no matrix space here, okay? So keep that in mind. There is no blood vessels coming through. It's avascular. All the nutrients that it gets has to come from the underlying tissues. Okay, so keep that in mind, because when we talk about connective tissue being widely distributed in our body, and there's really 4 classes, and it depends on what reference you look at. They'll break it down into various different references, or classes of connective tissue. But you want to keep that in mind that typically with connective tissue is that there's cells, and then there's a lot of space in between from one cell to the next. And that space is usually filled in with a substance that gives that tissue its characteristics. So let's look at the 4 classes. We got connective tissue proper, we got cartilage, bone tissue, and then blood. So here's a comparison. We got connective tissue proper, we got bone tissue, we got blood, and we got cartilage. So what we have then, we have subclasses of the connective tissue proper. We have loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, okay? And then we have spongy bone, compact bone. We'll talk more about that in the skeletal system. Blood, we'll talk more about that when you get to the blood chapter. And then what we have is cartilage then too. But we all have, they all have the same thing here, in that we have cells, and then we have space, like this matrix space. You can see here's the cells, here's some cells, and we have the space around the cells that's filled with some sort of substance, okay? So we have the blood cells here, white blood cells, red blood cells. There's going to be some platelets scattered throughout there, and then the space around the cells is the matrix. Same with the bone, okay? And the bone, and we'll talk about this in a little bit here, the matrix gives like these sort of classes of connective tissue their unique sort of characteristics. So connective tissue proper, loose and dense. We're not going to get into that much detail. You don't need to know really the large difference between those two. But I'm going to cover what you really need to know about the connective tissue here. One being the major functions of the connective tissue. Okay, so epithelial tissue had a couple different functions depending on if it was simple or stratified. Again, simple was usually allowed for, depending on squamous or cuboidal or columnar, but usually allowed for absorption or secretion of mucus or secretion of other substances. And then the simple squamous was allowing for diffusion. If we had stratified squamous, that was more for protection of underlying tissue. And so what we'll see the functions of connective tissue in general, because they're so diverse. I mean, you think of bone and blood being two different, completely different sort of substances, but it's still they both fall under a connective tissue category. What we see is binding and support. So it binds areas together, supports other areas. Protection, provides protection for areas. It provides insulation, okay, for certain types of connective tissue, and transportation. That's really with blood. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics. The big thing is that here, I want you to recognize this big sort of characteristic. Cells separated by non-living extracellular matrix, the ground substance and fibers. So we have the cell here, okay, this is our cell, and then we have the space around the cell. The space around the cell, that's considered the matrix, and that matrix is going to be filled with the ground substance, is referred to some of the material, and various different fibers. Okay, so we have typically with connective tissue a lot of matrix space filled with various different molecules and substances. So the ground substance, okay, this is the medium which through solutes diffuse between blood capillaries and the cells. Okay, so I don't want to get into very sort of descriptive measure of ground substance, but again, the ground substance is this sort of medium, this sort of material that is in between the cells. It's found in the matrix space around the cells. And that's what we have as ground substance. And so the components, we'll see interstitial fluid, adhesion proteins, glue, protoglycans. Okay, so there's some really wicked stuff within there. And for our simplicity's sake, we don't need to get into that much detail. But I want to cover these connective tissue fibers, these fibers that are found within the various different connective tissues. We have collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers are the strongest and most abundant. So when we talk about the different types of connective tissue, collagen fibers will be talked about a lot. And what they have, or what they are, excuse me, are these, you think of like a steel rod or a beam, right? They're very strong, but they have some tensile strength, so they can bend a bit. They don't break very easily. They give a lot of strength to a certain region of the body. The elastic fibers are long, thin fibers that allow for stretch. You think like a rubber band. So you can stretch a rubber band out, but when you remove that tension on it, it returns to its normal sort of size and shape, right? You can stretch it out and it returns it. It's elastic. And then the reticular fibers are short, fine, highly branched collagenous fibers. And so these are kind of like, you think of, I describe them as like what's used for as like a spongy area. So sponginess in that sort of thing. So there's those three types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, that will come up in various discussions as we talk about different tissues and different organ systems. Again, here the cells, don't want to get into quite a few sort of discussions on that, or quite an in-depth discussion, but typically what we see in connective tissue is that you'll have these mitotically active and cells that secrete out things that have the suffix blast. The mature cells will have the suffix sites. So you'll see chondroblasts and chondrocytes in cartilage. Chondro being referring to cartilage, sites then mature cells. So the cartilage mature cells, and then you have the cartilage mitotically active and secreting cells as the chondroblasts. We have osteoblasts. Osteo is referring to bone, blasts referring to secretory cells, and then the osteocytes in bones being the mature cells here, okay? So we have those sort of things that we find in the cells. So you have the mature cells, and then you typically have these other cells that are highly active, growing and dividing and secreting out various different substances, whether that's ground substance or whether that's, like the chondroblasts will be secreting out ground substance to give the cartilage Elastic cartilage, for example, has elastic fibers in it and some other ground substance. So it will secrete out fibers of that to kind of give you that sense of that characteristic that elastic cartilage has. You think of your nose and your ears, right? It can kind of bend, twist, and turn, and it returns back to its normal shape. That's largely because of the chondrocytes and the chondroblasts found within the cartilage tissue there. All right, so we can see here all sorts of different things within, they're showing all sorts of different cells making up the sort of connective tissue. We have macrophage, we have a neutrophil referring to, white blood cells, a lymphocyte, we have a fibroblast, we have a capillary in here, we have a fat cell. Okay, so this is just giving you an example. It's not really well organized and that sort of thing, but yeah, so connective tissue can kind of look like a big mess sometimes because there's all these fibers like collagen fibers, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, kind of all blended in together, and it just kind of looks like a big sort of kind of chaotic mess at times, but there is much organization to it though. We're not going to talk about the embryonic part of connective tissue. But again, so when we go over the connective tissue, we're going to look at the description of the tissue, the function, and location. So again, connective tissue proper, one class, we have loose and dense connective tissue. There's a couple different types. So this is loose connective tissue areolar. And so you can kind of see we have the collagen fibers in here, we have elastic fibers in here, and we have fibroblasts in there. So this really helps cushions organs and wraps them around, so it kind of maintains them in their appropriate place. And it can hold and convey tissue fluid too. So it's a gel-like matrix with all three fibers found within there. So adipose tissue, this is our fat storage tissues. It's found all over our body, probably in too many spots, right? So each one of these cells actually is storing fat, a big droplet of fat in there. And so you want to be aware of that. That's part of loose connective tissue. Another type of loose connective tissue is reticular. So we have all these reticular fibers in here. Kind of looks like a big mess, doesn't it? Again, so we have our cells, the white blood cells, the lymphocytes here, and then we have our reticular fibers, and this is kind of what you see in the spleen. So it forms a soft internal skeleton that supports other cell types like white blood cells and macrophages and stuff like that. Dense connective tissue, we have dense regular, so we have collagen fibers, the nuclei of the fibroblasts that will secrete out collagen fibers. And so where you see dense regular connective tissue is in tendons and most ligaments. So our tendons and ligaments are made up of this dense connective tissue, which provides, we'll talk about the role of tendons and ligaments when we talk about the muscular system here in a few weeks. And then we have dense irregular, so going from, looks like organized sort of collagen fibers to irregular collagen fiber organization. And so this is found in, joint capsules of various organs and joints. So it's, and again, you don't need to know this in specific detail. You're not going to be quizzed in this course on specific sort of characteristics. But going through and kind of understanding, seeing where these kind of come in, because we'll talk about the joint capsule again when we talk about articulations and stuff like that. So dense connective tissue, elastic cartilage, I'm sorry, not elastic, but elastic tissue, again gives an ability, elastic, you think of a rubber band, could stretch out and kind of return, so same thing. So we find this in walls of the large blood vessels, arteries in our body, because they have to stretch to accommodate the flow of blood through it, and so we want to have some good elastic fibers within there. All right, so going on to then the second class of cartilage, there's three types of cartilage. We have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. What we have in hyaline cartilage, again, so we have these cells kind of like in this sort of lacuna, we call it, this like little space. So you can see cell here, here, okay? And there's a lot of space in between the cells, which is, forms the matrix. The matrix is the space around the cells. And so what we find is within the ground substance, a firm matrix, collagen fibers, and, supports and reinforces areas and resists compressive stress. So we find hyaline cartilage in the connecting points from our ribs to our sternum here. So you can see what's in pink here, that's all hyaline cartilage. And so it supports and reinforces any sort of compressive stress put upon the chest there. So it doesn't necessarily break like bone, but it can definitely withstand the stress and not have that sort of fracture. And it's also found on the ends of long bones and joint cavities and stuff like that. So hyaline cartilage is a very common sort of cartilage found in the body, as we talk about. Elastic cartilage, again, ears is a big thing. On the nose, we'll find the epiglottis, and what it has is kind of like the cells, and the space around the cells is the matrix, which is filled in with the elastic fibers that helps to maintain a shape of a structure while allowing flexibility, right? You think your ears, you can kind of flex them in, and then when you let go of the stress put upon them, they go back to their normal sort of shape and size, okay? Fibrocartilage, this is stuff that we commonly see in between our intervertebral discs and the discs of the knee joint and the symphic pubis, or pubic symphysis, connecting the two hip bones. Again, we have the chondrocytes, these little tiny cells, and lots of space in between them where they secrete out various thick collagen fibers to give a very sort of tensile strength, a very strong sort of connection, and then ability to absorb compressive shock. So you think of our knees, the meniscus in our knees, that's more of fibrocartilage there. Okay, bone is another type of connective tissue, and what we see with bone is compact and spongy bone, two types, and we'll get into more detail when we talk about the skeletal system here. But bone, we have, whether we're talking about compact or spongy, we have these cells, and they're in this lacuna, this little space here, so these tiny little cells, and we'll see osteocytes and osteoblasts, and even osteoclasts, we'll learn about them. But what we see is there's, in compact bone, it's highly organized, and we're not going to get into that organization, but I want you to recognize that here's the cell, and then here's the space in between the cell. And that space in between the cell is filled up with, well, that's called the matrix, the space between the cells. And that matrix is filled with collagen fibers and a calcium phosphate salt, okay? And so you think of bone, the characteristic of bone is hard, but when it's in a living organism, it's living tissue. It's not some inanimate object. It's actual living sort of tissue. It needs blood, it needs nutrients, and it's very highly active. And so what this calcium phosphate salt and the collagen fibers in the matrix, that gives the bone its hardness and its strength to be able to support the framework of the body, okay? Blood is another type of connective tissue, and we have the blood cells as the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. So there's three types of blood cells. And then the plasma is considered the matrix, or the extracellular matrix, the space around the cells. And the matrix in this case, the plasma, is mostly composed of water, and then there's going to be some solutes and some proteins in there. But looking at this in a close sort of picture, we have red blood cells, tons of red blood cells in here, a little platelet, a white blood cell, and the matrix you can't really see, but it's the fluid that would be surrounding these cells, and the function is to transport gases, nutrients, and waste and other substances throughout the body. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in detail later on. Another class of connective tissue is nervous tissue, and nervous tissue is composed of, what's interesting is two main cells, the neurons, which are actually the nerve cells, and then we have the neuroglia cells, which are found in the matrix, but they're another type of cell that actually assist the neurons. Okay, so here is, this is not the best picture of a nerve cell, but here's a kind of schematic drawing of a nerve cell here. Okay, and we'll talk about its unique characteristics when we get to the nervous system. But again, the function of the nerve cells to transmit electrical signals from one end to the other. And so it will transmit an electrical signal from this end down to this end and pass that information along to the next cell, whether that's a nerve cell or whether that's a muscle cell, whatever it may be. And we find the nerve cells primarily in the brain and spinal cord and then the peripheral nerves. So here's a neuron, right? And then you can see all these little dots here. These are neuroglia cells found in the matrix of nerve tissue. So here's another picture. Here's a kind of a little picture you can kind of see. So here's the actual nerve cell right here. So here's the neuron, that's the main cell that transmits electrical impulses. And all these little blue specks and dots are considered neuroglial cells. They're found in the matrix of space around the nerve cells. And they, again, their role is to support the neuron in its function primarily. Last type of tissue that we have is muscle tissue or muscular tissue. And we have three, excuse me, we have three categories of muscular tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is what we find attached to the skeleton, pretty straightforward, the bones of our body. The cardiac muscle is the muscle of the heart, and the smooth muscle is the muscle found within the viscera, or the viscera is a fancy term for internal organs. So our blood vessels, our stomach, our intestinal tract, our bladder, all sorts of things. The uterus in women, that's going to be lined with smooth muscle. And so skeletal muscle has this sort of long cylinder shape to it. Okay, it's long and skinny cell. It actually has more than one nucleus in the cell itself. It's under voluntary movement control, which means that you have to voluntarily, consciously think about moving, contracting that muscle to be able to move. And it's considered striated because the way the proteins are arranged in the muscle cell, you can see it produces this dark light band striations within the actual muscle cell itself. Okay, so these are the nuclei here. This would be like one cell here. Okay, they can get pretty long because you think of your bicep or your thigh muscle, you know, they can run the entire length of that muscle there. So found in attached to the bones of the body. And a little to the skin sometimes, and that's more for facial expression. So the big goal of these muscles is locomotion or movement, body movement, you know, and facial control and stuff like that. So again, voluntary control, you have to, you know, unless you have a muscle twitch, that's involuntary, but for the large part, these muscles are under voluntary control. You have to consciously think about moving them. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, and it is striated too. It has those striations. So the way the protein is set up in the muscle cell, you see these light dark bands, okay, giving it this striation part. This intercalated disc sort of thing, this dark region right here, this is the sort of border between one cell and the next. So here's one cell ranging from here to here, and this intercalated disc is a fancy, really unique junction point that allows nutrients to pass and electrical impulses to pass from one cell to the next, one muscle cell to the next, okay? As it contracts, again, it's going to contract, and its goal is to propel blood through the circulatory system. The thing is, it's involuntary control. That means you have no conscious control over the contraction of this muscle, right? Which is nice because you don't want to be having to worry about sleeping and telling your heart to contract at the same time. So involuntary control. Smooth muscle, this is again found usually in the internal organs like the walls. The stomach contraction, the intestinal contraction, the bladder contraction, that's going to be smooth muscle. These cells look kind of not goofy, but they're kind of spindled, so they get thinner at the end here, and so they don't line up very well. It looks like just big one mass of cells clumped together. So here you can't really kind of see the spindle end here of this one cell, but I mean they're hard to differentiate between one another. Because just the way their shaped are and how clumped or how they kind of clump together like that or organize together. And again, their goal is to propel substances or objects, urine, food, a baby in the case of delivery, along an internal passageway. So it's involuntary control, so you don't think about it, right? You can't control your stomach contractions, right? It always rumbles or grumbles. That's your stomach contractions of the smooth muscle in the stomach at the most inopportune time, right? When you're kind of reading or something like that and it's quiet and then all of a sudden your stomach's making all those noises. But that's because of the smooth muscle contracting in there, okay? Now lastly, our last thing that we're going to talk about is epithelial membranes. And there's three types of epithelial membranes. Okay, so think of epithelial. Again, we talked about epithelial tissue. Okay, so this is the membranes that the epithelial tissue can form. So there's the cutaneous membrane, which is the skin, which we have a whole chapter dedicated to it. There's the mucosas, or the mucous membranes, not the mucosal, but the mucous membranes and the mucosa. These line body cavities open to the external part of the body. So the digestive, the respiratory tract, like your mouth, that's a mucous membrane, your nose. And then we have the serous membranes, and the serosa membranes are usually in a closed ventral body cavity. Okay, so we'll take a look at each one here. So the cutaneous membrane, epithelial membrane, is your skin. And again, we'll talk about that in great detail. The mucosal membrane, this is found in the lung cavity and the trachea and the esophagus and the stomach, okay, and in the nasal and the oral cavities here. That's the mucosal membrane. They've line body cavities open to the exterior. And then the serous membranes line body cavities close to the exterior, okay? So whatever's closed, you can't get to from the external without opening up the body. So we have this cavity around the lungs, which is not exposed to the external, the cavity around the heart. So we have the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium, and same with the pleural. Around the lung. We have a parietal and visceral peritoneum in the intestinal tract here. Okay, so those are the serous membranes. They line body cavities close to the external part of the body, and that's going to be filled or going to be lined with various types of epithelial tissue. Okay, so I hope this has given you a better overview of the tissues. So again, understand basically the 4 types of tissues, their general functions and goals. I don't want to say goals, but their general function and responsibilities within the body. With epithelial tissue, understand the difference between simple and stratified, and then especially simple squamous and stratified squamous, what their role, how that differs. Connective tissue, general functions of connective tissue, and the idea that the matrix space can be filled up with this ground substance or these 3 different types of fibers, and I would like you to get to really recognize those 3 different fibers, because they'll come up in later lectures. And then with the muscular, there's the 3 different types of muscle tissue. Make sure you understand the difference in their location and their function, and then if they're voluntary, involuntary. And then with the nervous system, you know, what the main goal of the neuron is that electrical transport, or that electrical activity to be, or I should say electrical signals to be transported, and then the neuroglia roles then too. So, and then the epithelial tissue. So you should be set then with this chapter. But if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a call, text, or email. So have a great day.